Good evening and welcome. Tonight, we are stepping into a version of the past that most people think they already know. A time preserved in carefully posed photographs, neatly pressed clothes, and polite smiles frozen in black and white. A decade often remembered as orderly, modest, and comforting. The 1950s. And more specifically, the 1950s London family. At first glance, it all looks reassuring. Fathers in tidy suits. Mothers in spotless aprons. Children lined up neatly, hair combed, socks pulled up, expressions carefully controlled. A world that appears stable, respectful, and calm. A world that many later generations would look back on and describe as simpler, even safer. A time when people supposedly knew their place, followed the rules, and slept soundly at night. But tonight, we are not here to admire the surface. We are here to look behind it. Because if you linger just a moment longer on those family photographs, something begins to feel off. The smiles do not quite reach the eyes. The posture is rigid. The atmosphere feels tight, as though everyone is holding their breath. These images do not show chaos or open conflict, but they do hint at something quieter and heavier. A kind of pressure that never announced itself, yet was always present. The truth is, the 1950s London family was not defined by ease. It was defined by endurance. This was a world shaped by recent memory. The war had ended, but it had not disappeared. It lingered in habits, in routines, in attitudes passed silently from parent to child. People had survived years of uncertainty, shortage, and fear, and survival had become a skill. Comfort, on the other hand, was still considered optional. And so, families learned to function not by expressing what they felt, but by controlling it. Politeness was not simply good manners, it was armor. Silence was not emptiness, it was discipline. Emotions were carefully managed, folded away like best clothes, brought out only when absolutely necessary. To complain too loudly, to want too much, or to ask too many questions was to risk being seen as weak, ungrateful, or worse, improper. Outwardly, everything was fine. Inwardly, things were far more complicated. Homes were small, often crowded, and rarely private. Personal space was a luxury few could afford, and even fewer expected. Family members shared rooms, routines, and unspoken rules. Every sound carried. Every action was noticed. Life unfolded under constant observation, not just from parents, but from neighbors, teachers, shopkeepers, and the wider community. In such an environment, the family became both a refuge and a pressure chamber. Roles were clearly defined. Fathers were expected to be steady, reserved, and authoritative. Mothers were expected to manage everything else quietly, efficiently, and without complaint. Children were expected to adapt, to learn quickly, to stay out of the way, to grow up without causing disruption. There was comfort in routine, yes, but there was also a cost. The day followed a strict rhythm, and everyone knew their place within it. Deviating from that rhythm, speaking out of turn, questioning authority, expressing discomfort was not encouraged. Instead, people learned to endure, to tolerate, to carry on, and they became very good at it. The idea of happiness, as we understand it today, was not the goal. Stability was. Respectability was. Getting through the day without drawing attention or creating difficulty was often considered success enough. Joy, when it appeared, was brief and understated. A good cup of tea. A quiet evening. A shared joke that never quite crossed into laughter. This emotional restraint shaped family life in subtle but lasting ways. Children learned early that feelings were something to be managed internally. If you were cold, you put on another layer. If you were upset, you stayed quiet. If you were afraid, you learned to hide it. Adults rarely explained their worries, but children sensed them anyway, absorbing tension like background noise. And so, even moments that were meant to be comforting, mealtimes, evenings at home, weekends, often carried an undercurrent of unease. Not because anything was actively wrong, but because everything had to stay right. This is where the dark side begins to reveal itself. Not in dramatic events, but in atmosphere. A constant awareness of expectation. A fear of making mistakes. A quiet competition for limited warmth, attention, or approval. The family unit was strong, but it was also tightly wound. People loved one another, but love was rarely spoken aloud. Affection existed in actions rather than words, in routine rather than reassurance. A prepared meal. A folded shirt. A silent understanding that everyone was doing their best, even if no one said so. Yet over time, this way of living left marks. Stress did not disappear simply because it was unspoken. It settled into daily life. It became normalized. What modern eyes might recognize as emotional strain was, at the time, simply considered character building. Hardship was framed as necessary. Discomfort as educational. And perhaps it was. But it also meant that many people carried feelings they never learned how to name. In the 1950s London family, tension did not explode, it accumulated. It gathered in small irritations. In the careful distribution of resources. In the strictness of routines. In the expectation that everyone should be grateful, regardless of how they felt. Arguments were often avoided, not resolved. Silence became the default response to conflict. From the outside, this looked like harmony. From the inside, it felt like pressure. This is not a story about villains or cruelty. It is a story about a system. About a generation shaped by survival, rebuilding, and restraint. A generation that believed firmly in doing what needed to be done, even if it meant putting personal comfort last. And in many ways, they succeeded. Families stayed together. Communities functioned. Life went on. But tonight, we are going to slow down and sit inside that life for a while. Not to judge it, but to understand it. To feel the weight of those expectations. To notice the small, everyday moments where tension quietly lived. Because history is not only found in major events or public milestones. It lives in kitchens, bedrooms, and narrow hallways. In routines repeated day after day. In things that were never said out loud. As we move deeper into this story, we will follow an ordinary day inside a 1950s London family. From the early morning cold to the carefully managed meals, from school routines to neighborhood scrutiny, from shared spaces to silent evenings. Nothing dramatic will happen. And that is precisely the point. This was a world where drama was discouraged, emotions were contained, and endurance was praised above all else. A world that looked calm but felt heavy. So settle in. Lower the lights. And let us take a closer look at the family life everyone thinks they remember. And the quiet truths hidden just beneath the surface. Cold was not simply a seasonal inconvenience in 1950s London households. It was a constant, shaping force that dictated how families lived, moved, and interacted with one another. It seeped into every corner of the home, every hour of the day, turning ordinary routines into quiet tests of endurance. Long after the end of the war, warmth remained a luxury rather than a guarantee, and the domestic environment reflected a city still recovering, still rationing, still learning how to survive with less. Most homes relied on a single coal fire, often located in the main living room. This one source of heat was expected to serve the entire household, an impossible task in narrow terraced houses with thin walls and poor insulation. Bedrooms, hallways, kitchens, and bathrooms remained unheated, transforming the house into a patchwork of tolerable and intolerable spaces. Families learned to cluster around the fire when possible, while accepting that the rest of the home would remain cold for most of the year. Mornings were especially unforgiving. Children woke to frosted windows and icy air that bit at exposed skin. The simple act of leaving the bed felt like a personal challenge, as the warmth trapped under heavy blankets disappeared the moment one stood up. Floors were cold enough to shock bare feet awake instantly, and the rush to dress became a race against discomfort rather than a matter of convenience. Clothes themselves offered little relief. Uniforms and undergarments were often thin, layered more for modesty than insulation. Hot water was scarce and strictly controlled. Many homes relied on kettles or small water tanks that needed time, fuel, and patience. Washing was often postponed or abbreviated, especially in winter months, reinforcing the idea that comfort was optional and cleanliness was negotiable. Cold taps were the norm, and the shock of water against skin was simply accepted as part of daily life. Children learned early that complaints would not change the temperature. The kitchen, despite being the heart of the home, was rarely warm. Coal fires were saved for heating rooms, not for comfort while preparing meals. Mothers cooked wearing coats or thick cardigans, hands stiff from cold as they prepared food on metal surfaces that never seemed to lose their chill. Windows were kept shut to preserve heat, yet drafts still found their way inside, curling under doors and through cracks in aging frames. Evenings offered only partial relief. Once the coal fire was lit, the living room became the only space where warmth could be felt, and even then it was uneven. Those closest to the fire felt its comfort, while others sat wrapped in blankets, rotating positions when possible. The fire dictated seating arrangements, conversations, and silence, creating an invisible hierarchy based on proximity to warmth. Arguments over who sat where were common, yet rarely spoken aloud. Fuel itself was a source of anxiety. Coal deliveries were not guaranteed, and families monitored their supplies carefully, aware that running out could mean days without heat. Fires were lit only when absolutely necessary, and extinguished early to preserve fuel. Children were taught not to waste warmth, to keep doors closed, and to accept the cold as something unavoidable rather than unfair. At night, the cold returned in full force. Bedrooms were unheated, and the warmth from the living room fire never reached upstairs. Beds were prepared with layers of blankets, often heavy and worn, sometimes accompanied by hot water bottles that offered temporary comfort. These bottles were cherished items, filled carefully and shared when supplies were limited. As the water cooled, the cold crept back in, waking sleepers in the early hours. The physical cold shaped emotional behavior as well. Affection was practical rather than expressive, often shown through actions like sharing blankets or sitting close rather than verbal reassurance. Families learned to conserve not only fuel but also emotional energy, reserving warmth for moments of necessity. Complaints were discouraged, framed as weakness or ingratitude in a time when many believed things could still be worse. Children internalized these conditions as normal. They grew accustomed to discomfort and learned resilience through routine exposure rather than explicit instruction. Cold classrooms, cold hallways, cold meals all reinforced the idea that endurance was a virtue. Comfort was not expected. It was earned, rare, and temporary. This constant exposure to cold left lasting impressions. It shaped memories, behaviors, and expectations well into adulthood. For many, warmth became synonymous with safety and success, something to be valued deeply once achieved. Yet during those years, it remained elusive, a reminder that post-war recovery was uneven and incomplete. The cold inside these homes was not dramatic or sudden. It did not announce itself loudly or violently. Instead, it persisted quietly, shaping daily life in subtle but relentless ways. It taught families how to adapt, how to endure, and how to live with limitations that could not be argued away. In doing so, it became one of the most defining features of domestic life in 1950s London, a silent presence that left its mark on an entire generation. Mourning in a 1950s London household was not a gentle transition from sleep to wakefulness. It was abrupt, disciplined, and shaped by necessity rather than comfort. The day began not with sunlight or alarm clocks, but with obligation. Time was structured tightly, movements were calculated, and hesitation carried consequences. Every family member understood that mornings were not meant to be enjoyed, only survived efficiently. The act of waking up itself was unpleasant. Bedrooms were cold, often colder than the outdoors during winter months. Breath formed faint clouds in the air, and blankets felt heavy not because they were warm, but because they were layered in defense against the cold. The moment a child pushed them aside, warmth vanished instantly. Lingering in bed was tempting, but rarely allowed. Parents enforced punctuality with firm voices and repeated reminders, emphasizing that delay would disrupt the entire household. Getting dressed was a race against discomfort. Clothes were laid out the night before, not for convenience, but because searching through drawers in the morning meant prolonged exposure to cold air. Undergarments were thin, woolen layers itchy, and uniforms stiff from frequent washing. Buttons were fastened with numb fingers, and socks were pulled on quickly to avoid contact with cold floors. Mirrors reflected sleepy faces flushed not with warmth, but with cold-induced redness. Bathrooms offered no relief. Many homes lacked indoor bathrooms, and those that had them were unheated. Washing was brief and functional. Cold water splashed onto faces, shocking children fully awake. Hot water, if available, was rationed carefully and often reserved for adults or special occasions. Teeth were brushed quickly, hands were dried inadequately, and lingering was discouraged. The bathroom was not a place of comfort. It was another checkpoint to pass through. The kitchen marked the next stage of the morning routine, and it too was governed by efficiency. Breakfast was simple and repetitive, designed to fuel the body rather than please the senses. Bread was toasted carefully to avoid waste, tea was brewed weak but hot, and portions were measured rather than generous. Everyone had an assigned place at the table, and conversations were minimal. Silence was not necessarily enforced, but it was expected. Time pressure defined every movement. Children were constantly reminded of the clock, even if no one looked at it directly. The rhythm of the household dictated when coats were put on, when bags were picked up, and when shoes were tied. Any delay caused tension, especially in homes where parents had strict work schedules. Mornings were collective efforts, and one person's slowness affected everyone else. Outerwear added another layer of discomfort. Coats were heavy and worn, scarves scratchy, gloves often mismatched or missing entirely. Shoes, already damp from previous days, were slipped on reluctantly. Laces were pulled tight more for stability than warmth. The final moments before leaving the house were hurried, marked by last-minute reminders and sharp glances rather than affection. Stepping outside did not mark the end of the ordeal. The cold air hit immediately, often sharper than indoors. Streets were gray and quiet, and children joined streams of others walking toward schools, heads down, hands in pockets. There was little sense of excitement or anticipation. Morning was a task to complete, not a moment to enjoy. Parents viewed this routine as preparation. Discomfort was framed as character building, a necessary part of growing up. Complaints were dismissed gently or ignored entirely. The expectation was clear: resilience mattered more than comfort. Children learned quickly that expressing displeasure would not change the routine, only prolong it. These rigid mornings shaped long-term habits. Many children grew into adults who valued punctuality, efficiency, and self-discipline above personal comfort. The morning routine taught them that the day demanded effort from the very beginning, and that success depended on readiness rather than mood. Warmth, relaxation, and personal space were rewards earned later, not rights granted freely. Emotionally, mornings reinforced hierarchy. Parents issued instructions, children followed them. There was little room for negotiation. Authority was not questioned, and routines were rarely adjusted for individual preference. The household functioned like a small system, each person playing a role that kept the day moving forward. Despite the discomfort, there was a sense of shared purpose. Everyone endured the same conditions, moved through the same cold rooms, and followed the same schedule. This collective experience created an unspoken understanding among family members. Mornings were difficult, but they were faced together, day after day. Over time, The memory of these mornings became softened by distance. What once felt harsh became remembered as structured, even grounding. Yet at the time, they were undeniably uncomfortable, shaped by post-war realities and cultural expectations that prioritized discipline over ease. Mornings in these homes were not moments of warmth or connection. They were practical, demanding, and emotionally restrained. They reflected a society focused on rebuilding, on moving forward without hesitation. And in their rigidity, they left lasting impressions on those who lived through them, teaching lessons about endurance that extended far beyond the front door. Life in a 1950s London neighborhood unfolded under constant observation. Streets were narrow, houses stood shoulder to shoulder, and windows faced directly into one another's lives. Privacy was not simply limited. It was practically non-existent. Every movement, habit, and deviation from routine was visible, noticed, and often remembered. The neighborhood itself acted as a silent system of surveillance, operating without formal rules but enforcing them all the same. Residents became experts in observation. A curtain, twitching slightly at the wrong hour, a door opening later than usual, or a visitor arriving unexpectedly could spark quiet curiosity. These details were rarely confronted directly. Instead, they were collected, shared subtly, and passed along through conversations that appeared harmless on the surface. Information traveled quickly, carried by casual remarks and knowing looks rather than direct accusations. This constant awareness shaped behavior. Families learned to present themselves carefully, maintaining appearances that aligned with neighborhood expectations. Laundry was hung out neatly, front steps were swept regularly, and children were instructed to behave properly not just for their parents, but for everyone watching. The street functioned as an extension of the home, and misbehavior carried consequences beyond the front door. Neighbors were both protectors and judges. There was comfort in knowing someone would notice if a child failed to come home on time or if an elderly resident did not open their curtains in the morning. At the same time, this vigilance came with pressure. Deviating from routine invited speculation. Silence, absence, or difference became topics of interest, interpreted through shared assumptions rather than confirmed facts. Women, especially those who spent more time at home, became central figures in this informal network. They observed from kitchen windows, doorsteps, and corner shops. Their conversations stitched together fragments of daily life into narratives that defined reputations. These narratives were rarely malicious, yet they held power. Once a family was labeled as careless, strange, or unreliable, that perception lingered. Children grew up acutely aware of being watched. They were warned not to embarrass the family, not to draw attention, and not to give neighbors something to talk about. This awareness followed them beyond childhood, shaping how they interacted with authority and community. The fear was not of punishment alone, but of being noticed in the wrong way. Homes themselves reflected this pressure. Front rooms were kept presentable even if they were rarely used. Furniture was arranged for appearance rather than comfort, and best items were saved for visitors. The visible parts of life were curated carefully, while private struggles remained hidden behind closed doors. Maintaining respectability mattered deeply, even when it came at emotional cost. Gossip acted as both entertainment and regulation. Stories circulated quietly, often softened with humor or concern, yet they reinforced boundaries. Someone who argued loudly, dressed differently, or kept unusual hours became a subject of discussion. Over time, these discussions shaped collective standards, making it clear what was acceptable and what was not. Despite this scrutiny, confrontation was rare. British social norms favored restraint and politeness. Judgment was expressed indirectly, through distance rather than dialogue. Invitations stopped arriving, conversations became shorter, and smiles grew tighter. Exclusion served as correction, reinforcing conformity without open conflict. For many, this environment created a sense of safety. Familiar faces, predictable routines, and shared expectations reduced uncertainty. Children played in the streets knowing multiple adults were watching, even if they were not directly supervising. Belongings were left unattended with confidence that someone would notice if they were disturbed. Trust existed, but it was conditional. At the same time, individuality was quietly discouraged. Standing out attracted attention, and attention brought scrutiny. Families learned to blend in, adopting similar habits, styles, and schedules. This sameness created cohesion, but it also suppressed expression. Personal struggles, unconventional ideas, or private ambitions were often kept hidden to avoid becoming topics of conversation. The emotional impact of this environment was subtle but lasting. People learned to monitor themselves constantly, adjusting behavior even when alone. The sense of being observed did not end at the street corner. It followed individuals into adulthood, shaping how they presented themselves in workplaces, relationships, and public spaces. Over time, memories of these neighborhoods became layered with nostalgia. Many recalled a strong sense of community, mutual care, and shared responsibility. Yet beneath that warmth lay the quiet pressure to conform, to remain unseen except in approved ways. The same system that protected also constrained. This network of observation required no technology, no formal authority, and no written rules. It relied entirely on proximity, routine, and shared values. In post-war London, where resources were scarce and stability was fragile, this form of social regulation provided order. It ensured predictability in uncertain times. The neighborhoods of the 1950s were not hostile places, but they were watchful. They shaped lives through expectation rather than force, guiding behavior through collective awareness. Every street became a small stage, every household a performer. And within that constant gaze, families learned how to live carefully, quietly, and in line with the rhythm of those around them. School in 1950s London was not designed to nurture comfort or individuality. It was structured to enforce discipline, obedience, and endurance. From the moment children stepped through the school gates, they entered an environment ruled by authority and expectation. The atmosphere was formal, restrained, and often intimidating, shaping behavior through pressure rather than encouragement. Classrooms were cold and austere. Large windows let in pale daylight but little warmth, and heating, if present at all, was unreliable. Wooden desks were heavy, scarred by generations of use, and bolted firmly to the floor. Children sat still for long periods, their bodies stiff with cold and posture corrected constantly. Movement was discouraged, and restlessness was interpreted as defiance rather than discomfort. Silence carried great importance. Talking out of turn, whispering, or shifting too much in one seat drew attention immediately. Teachers controlled the room through presence alone, their authority reinforced by tradition and social expectation. Instructions were delivered clearly and firmly, leaving little room for questions. Understanding was assumed, and confusion was treated as a personal failure rather than a gap in teaching. Public questioning was a common practice. Students were called upon without warning, expected to stand and answer correctly. Hesitation invited scrutiny. Incorrect answers were not always met with kindness. They became lessons for the entire class, reinforcing the cost of mistakes. This created an environment where fear of being wrong often outweighed curiosity or enthusiasm for learning. Written work was equally demanding. Ink pens required precision, and spills were permanent reminders of error. Pages were inspected carefully, handwriting judged as a reflection of character. Neatness mattered as much as content, and sloppiness was seen as a moral flaw. Children learned to associate academic performance with personal worth, a connection that followed many well beyond school years. Uniforms reinforced conformity. Clothing was identical, designed to erase visible differences and emphasize belonging. Any deviation, whether a missing button or worn shoes, was noticed and commented on. Appearance became another standard to meet, another way to fail publicly. For families with limited means, maintaining acceptable uniforms added quiet stress to daily life. The emotional tone of school days was serious and restrained. Laughter was rare and often discouraged. Play existed, but it was contained within strict boundaries and schedules. Even during breaks, supervision was constant. Games followed rules closely, and conflicts were resolved through authority rather than discussion. The goal was order, not expression. Teachers themselves operated under pressure. They were expected to maintain control, produce results, and uphold the school's reputation. Warmth was secondary to structure. Praise was limited, delivered cautiously to avoid encouraging pride. Discipline, by contrast, was immediate and visible. The system relied on consistency rather than empathy. Children adapted quickly. They learned when to speak, when to stay silent, and how to blend into the background. Many developed strategies to avoid attention altogether, choosing invisibility over risk. Others excelled academically, not from passion, but from a desire to avoid correction. Success became a form of protection. The curriculum emphasized memorization and repetition. Creativity had little place in daily lessons. Facts were recited, rules followed, and answers standardized. Independent thinking was not actively discouraged, but it was rarely rewarded. The focus remained on producing reliable, obedient students prepared to fit into existing structures. This environment shaped social relationships. Friendships formed quietly, often through shared experiences rather than open expression. Trust was built through subtle gestures and shared glances rather than open conversation. Emotional vulnerability was risky, as it could attract unwanted attention. Children learned to keep feelings contained, a habit that often extended into adulthood. Fear did not always come from explicit punishment. More often, it existed as an undercurrent, a constant awareness of being watched and evaluated. The possibility of correction was enough to shape behavior. Over time, this fear became internalized, guiding actions even in the absence of authority. Despite its severity, many adults later described this schooling as character building. They credited it with teaching resilience, focus, and respect for rules. Yet these lessons came at a cost. Curiosity was often suppressed, confidence built cautiously, and emotional expression limited. The system produced stability, but not always fulfillment. School days ended with relief rather than satisfaction. Leaving the building felt like stepping out of a controlled space into relative freedom. Still, the lessons learned inside did not stay behind. They followed children home, influencing how they spoke, sat, and thought about themselves. The legacy of this fear-based environment was subtle but enduring. It shaped how individuals responded to authority, how they approached challenges, and how they measured success. For some, it fostered discipline and determination. For others, it left lingering anxiety and self-doubt. School life in 1950s London was not overtly harsh, but it was deeply demanding. It relied on structure, expectation, and quiet pressure to mold behavior. In doing so, it reflected a society focused on order and recovery, where emotional softness was seen as a luxury and endurance was valued above all else. Food in 1950s London was not about enjoyment, creativity, or personal preference. It was about function. Meals existed to provide energy, maintain health, and stretch limited resources as far as possible. Even years after the war had ended, rationing and scarcity continued to shape what families ate, how they cooked, and how they thought about food itself. Shopping for food was a routine defined by limitation. Households relied on ration books, and choices were dictated more by availability than desire. Shops displayed modest selections, and shelves were rarely abundant. Families planned meals carefully around what could be obtained rather than what might be enjoyed. Surprise was uncommon. Repetition was expected. Ingredients were treated with respect because waste was unacceptable. Nothing was thrown away casually. Leftovers were saved, reworked, and served again in altered forms. A meal rarely existed on its own. It was part of a continuous cycle of reuse. What appeared on the table one evening often reappeared days later, transformed just enough to seem different. Cooking methods reflected this mindset. Meals were practical and predictable. Boiling, baking, and slow cooking dominated, chosen for their efficiency and reliability rather than flavor. Seasoning was minimal, not only due to cost but also habit. Strong flavors were viewed with suspicion, while plainness was associated with wholesomeness and discipline. Meat, when available, was stretched carefully. Small portions were combined with vegetables, potatoes, or bread to create filling dishes. A roast might appear once a week, followed by days of leftovers turned into pies, hashes, or stews. The original meal carried symbolic importance, while the subsequent versions were accepted without complaint. Vegetables formed the backbone of many meals. Root vegetables, cabbages, and greens were common, valued for their availability and durability. Fresh produce was seasonal, and out-of-season expectations did not exist. Families adjusted naturally to what the land and supply chains could provide, accepting monotony as normal. Mealtimes followed strict structure. Breakfast, lunch, and supper occurred at predictable hours, reinforcing routine and stability. Snacks were rare and often discouraged. Eating outside designated times was seen as indulgent or unnecessary. Food was not used for comfort. It was used for sustenance. Children were taught to eat what was given without question. Preferences were irrelevant. Plates were expected to be cleared, and refusal was interpreted as ingratitude. Hunger, whether real or anticipated, encouraged compliance. The lesson was clear: food was a privilege, not a choice. The dining environment mirrored this seriousness. Meals were quiet, focused, and efficient. Conversation was limited, especially during the working week. Eating was not an event. It was a task to complete before returning to responsibilities. Pleasure, if present, was understated and unspoken. Mothers carried much of the burden of this system. They were expected to provide meals that were filling, economical, and respectable despite limited resources. Creativity was expressed not through flavor, but through ingenuity. Success was measured by whether everyone ate enough, not whether anyone enjoyed it. Cooking skills were practical rather than expressive. Recipes were passed down through observation rather than written instruction. Measurements were approximate, based on experience rather than precision. Consistency mattered more than experimentation. A reliable meal was preferable to a risky one. Eating outside the home was rare. Cafes and restaurants were reserved for special occasions or specific needs. Home meals dominated daily life, reinforcing the importance of domestic food preparation. The kitchen was not a place of leisure. It was a workspace governed by routine and responsibility. The emotional relationship with food was restrained. Gratitude was expected, but excitement was discouraged. Treats existed, but they were occasional and modest. A simple dessert or a sweet item held significance precisely because it was rare. Pleasure, when it appeared, was brief and carefully controlled. Food shortages shaped memory. Many who grew up during this time retained lifelong habits of frugality. Even when abundance later became available, the instinct to save, reuse, and avoid waste remained strong. Scarcity left a lasting imprint on behavior and values. Despite these limitations, meals played an important role in maintaining family structure. Sitting together reinforced order and routine. The predictability of meals provided stability in uncertain times. Even without enjoyment, shared eating created a sense of continuity and belonging. Cultural expectations reinforced these practices. Endurance was admired, and complaints were discouraged. Accepting plain food without protest was seen as a sign of good character. The ability to make do reflected moral strength as much as practicality. Over time, this approach to food shaped attitudes toward comfort and desire. Satisfaction was defined by sufficiency rather than delight. Fullness mattered more than flavor. Hunger was something to be managed, not explored. Eating became an act of responsibility rather than expression. The absence of pleasure did not mean the absence of care. Effort was visible in preparation, timing, and consistency. Providing meals was an act of duty and quiet love, even if it lacked warmth or variety. Care was shown through reliability rather than indulgence. This post-war food culture reflected a society focused on recovery and discipline. Resources were limited and priorities were clear. Food was fuel, meals were routine, and pleasure was secondary. In this environment, survival shaped taste, and necessity defined tradition. The legacy of this era lived on long after rationing ended. Habits formed during these years influenced how people cooked, ate, and valued food throughout their lives. What began as adaptation became identity, shaping a generation's relationship with nourishment and comfort. In 1950s London homes, food sustained bodies and structured days. It was not meant to inspire or delight. It existed to support life, reinforce routine, and remind families that endurance, once again, came before pleasure. Shared bedrooms were a defining feature of family life in 1950s London. Space was limited, housing was crowded, and privacy was considered a luxury rather than a necessity. Children rarely had rooms of their own. Instead, siblings slept together in spaces that were practical, crowded, and shaped by constant negotiation. These rooms became arenas of quiet conflict, but also places where lifelong bonds were formed. Beds were often arranged closely, sometimes pushed against the same wall, sometimes stacked in bunks to save space. Mattresses were thin and well used, springs occasionally creaking with every movement. Personal belongings were minimal and rarely stored separately. Drawers, shelves, and bedside tables were shared by default, blurring the line between what belonged to one child and what belonged to another. Arguments arose over small things. Blankets were pulled back and forth during cold nights. One sibling claimed more space, another complained about noise or movement. Even breathing too loudly could become a source of irritation in the dark. These disputes were rarely dramatic, but they were constant, shaping the emotional atmosphere of the room. Parents intervened only when necessary. Children were expected to resolve minor issues themselves. Complaints were met with reminders about fairness, gratitude, and the realities of limited space. The message was clear: adaptation was required. Learning to share was not optional. It was a daily necessity. Nighttime intensified emotions. The lack of privacy meant there was no escape from each other's presence. Frustrations built quietly, especially after long days of school and responsibility. Yet nighttime also created opportunities for connection. Once the household settled into silence, whispered conversations emerged. Stories were shared, secrets exchanged, and fears admitted softly in the dark. These late-night moments often became the most emotionally open part of the day. Without adult oversight, siblings revealed thoughts they would never voice during daylight hours. The shared room became a space where vulnerability felt safer, protected by darkness and mutual understanding. Conflicts did not disappear, but they were balanced by moments of trust. Shared bedrooms also reinforced hierarchy. Older siblings often claimed authority, deciding who slept where or which items could be used. Younger children adapted, sometimes resenting this dynamic, sometimes relying on it for protection. These roles were rarely questioned, becoming part of the family's internal structure. Privacy was negotiated through routine rather than space. Changing clothes required timing and cooperation. Moments alone were created by turning faces away, closing eyes, or waiting patiently. Children learned subtle boundaries, understanding when to speak and when to remain silent. These skills translated later into social awareness and emotional restraint. Personal identity developed quietly in these conditions. Without private space, self-expression was limited. Posters, toys, and books were shared or rotated. Individual preferences existed, but they were secondary to collective harmony. Children learned to compromise their desires to maintain peace, often internalizing this behavior well into adulthood. Despite frequent tension, shared hardship strengthened relationships. Enduring the same cold nights, cramped conditions, and strict routines created a sense of unity. Siblings became witnesses to each other's lives, sharing memories that no one else fully understood. This shared history formed the foundation of deep, lasting bonds. The room itself absorbed these experiences. Worn floors, chipped furniture, and familiar smells became markers of time passing. Every scratch and dent told a story. The space evolved with the children, holding their laughter, arguments, and quiet moments of reflection. It was not a retreat, but it was a constant. Parents viewed these arrangements as normal. Separate rooms were associated with indulgence rather than necessity. Sharing was framed as character building, teaching patience, tolerance, and cooperation. Emotional discomfort was seen as a reasonable trade-off for practical living. Morning routines began in these shared spaces, setting the tone for the day. The rush to dress, wash, and prepare was intensified by limited room. Movement required coordination, and delays affected everyone. These mornings reinforced teamwork, even when tempers flared. Over time, these shared experiences shaped how siblings related to one another as adults. Some carried lingering resentments, others deep affection. Many remembered the lack of privacy vividly, yet spoke warmly of the closeness it created. Distance later in life often amplified nostalgia for those crowded rooms. The absence of personal space also influenced emotional regulation. Children learned to contain feelings, expressing frustration quietly rather than explosively. Loud displays drew attention and intervention. Silence became a tool, a way to coexist without constant conflict. Not all experiences were positive. For some, shared bedrooms intensified stress and anxiety. Constant proximity left little room to process emotions privately. Yet even these difficulties contributed to resilience, teaching children how to navigate complex relationships under pressure. These rooms were not designed to foster comfort or individuality. They existed to serve necessity. Yet within their limitations, children found ways to connect, adapt, and grow. The shared bedroom became both a testing ground and a refuge, depending on the moment. The bonds formed in these spaces were shaped by endurance rather than ease. Siblings learned each other's habits, moods, and fears intimately. This familiarity bred both irritation and loyalty. Arguments could be sharp, but protection was instinctive. In later years, memories of shared bedrooms often surfaced unexpectedly. The sound of breathing in the dark, the weight of shared blankets, the quiet laughter after lights out. These details lingered, tied to a time when life felt constrained yet deeply connected. Shared bedrooms in 1950s London were not just sleeping spaces. They were environments that shaped personality, relationships, and emotional habits. Within their narrow walls, children learned how to coexist, compromise, and care for one another, lessons that extended far beyond childhood. Housework in 1950s London was far more than a set of practical tasks. It was a public statement, a measure of respectability, and a reflection of moral character. A well-kept home signaled discipline, stability, and pride, while disorder invited judgment. For many women, domestic labor became a continuous performance carried out under the watchful eyes of family and neighborhood alike. Cleaning followed strict routines. Floors were swept daily, surfaces dusted methodically, and furniture polished until it reflected light. These actions were repeated not because dirt accumulated quickly, but because consistency mattered. Cleanliness was expected, and deviation suggested neglect. The appearance of the home spoke louder than any explanation. Laundry was a demanding process. Washing machines were rare, and much of the work was done by hand. Clothes were soaked, scrubbed, wrung out, and hung carefully to dry. Weather dictated schedules, and delays created stress. Clean clothes were not merely functional. They were symbols of competence and care. Ironing added another layer of responsibility. Shirts, uniforms, and linens were pressed meticulously. Creases mattered. Wrinkles implied laziness or lack of control. This attention to detail required time and focus, often performed in cold rooms with limited comfort. Yet the result was visible proof of effort, reinforcing social expectations. Kitchens required constant attention. Surfaces were wiped repeatedly, cookware cleaned immediately after use. A tidy kitchen suggested order and reliability. Even if meals were simple, their preparation needed to appear controlled and intentional. Disorder in the kitchen reflected poorly on the household as a whole. Housework was closely tied to identity. For many women, it defined their role and value within both family and community. Success was measured not in praise, but in the absence of criticism. When standards were met, the work went unnoticed. When they were not, judgment was swift and often silent. Neighbors noticed details. Windowsills, doorsteps, and curtains became indicators of effort. A dusty sill or unwashed step invited quiet commentary. These observations reinforced pressure to maintain appearances, even when energy or resources were limited. The home became an extension of public space. Time management was critical. Housework had to fit around childcare, meal preparation, and other responsibilities. There was little room for rest. Tasks flowed into one another, creating a cycle that repeated daily. Completion brought no lasting relief, as the work would begin again the next morning. Children participated in these routines from an early age. They were taught to clean, organize, and contribute. This participation reinforced expectations of order and responsibility. Housework became part of upbringing, shaping attitudes toward labor and duty. Despite its demands, housework was rarely framed as a burden. Cultural narratives emphasized pride, resilience, and fulfillment. Expressing frustration was discouraged. Satisfaction was expected to come from maintaining standards rather than personal comfort. Emotional labor accompanied physical effort, reinforcing restraint. The living room held particular importance. Often reserved for guests, it was kept in near-perfect condition. Furniture was arranged carefully, and certain items were protected from daily use. This room represented the household's public face, even if it remained largely untouched. Housework also reinforced class distinctions. Possessions like vacuum cleaners or modern appliances carried social weight. Owning such items suggested progress and stability. Their absence required compensatory effort, increasing labor to meet the same standards. Technology did not eliminate expectations, it shifted them. The mental load of maintaining a household was significant. Remembering schedules, managing supplies, and anticipating needs required constant attention. This invisible labor went largely unacknowledged. Success was assumed. Failure was noted. Moments of quiet satisfaction did exist. A freshly cleaned room, neatly folded laundry, or orderly shelves provided a sense of accomplishment. These moments were brief, but meaningful. They affirmed effort in a system that rarely offered explicit recognition. Housework also shaped family dynamics. Cleanliness rules influenced behavior, limiting where children could play and how objects were handled. Order became a shared value, enforced through routine rather than discussion. The home operated as a controlled environment, reflecting broader social norms. Fatigue was common but rarely addressed. Rest was secondary to responsibility. Tasks were completed, regardless of weather, mood, or physical discomfort. Endurance was valued and resilience was expected. Over time, these routines became ingrained. Even as circumstances changed, habits remained. Many carried these standards into later life, continuing to clean and organize with the same intensity. The performance did not end when observation decreased. It had become internalized. The pressure to maintain appearances influenced emotional expression. Feelings were managed quietly to avoid disruption. Control extended beyond physical space into personal demeanor. Calmness and composure became part of the household aesthetic. Housework in this era was not simply about cleanliness. It was about maintaining order in a world that had experienced chaos. Structure offered reassurance. Routine created predictability. The home became a place where control could be exercised, even when other areas of life felt uncertain. The daily performance of domestic labor reflected broader cultural values. Discipline, respectability, and perseverance were prioritized over comfort and self-expression. Within these expectations, women carried the responsibility of presenting stability to the outside world. This constant effort shaped identities and relationships. It reinforced gender roles, influenced childhood memories, and defined standards that persisted long after circumstances changed. Housework became a silent language, communicating worth, care, and conformity. In 1950s London, a clean home was not just a place to live. It was proof of effort, morality, and resilience. Behind polished surfaces and orderly rooms lay countless hours of unseen labor, performed daily, quietly, and without pause. Evenings in a 1950s London household followed a rhythm that was rarely questioned. The workday ended, daylight faded, and the home shifted into a quieter, more controlled mode. This was the part of the day when authority became most visible, not through raised voices or confrontation, but through ritual, routine, and expectation. The household reorganized itself around a single figure whose presence defined the tone of the evening. The return of the father marked a clear transition. Coats were hung, shoes placed aside, and the atmosphere subtly changed. Movement slowed, voices softened, and distractions were reduced. The home adjusted instinctively, as though responding to an unspoken signal. This shift was not dramatic, but it was deeply ingrained. The living room became the central space of the evening. Chairs were arranged deliberately, with one particular seat holding special significance. This chair, often positioned closest to the fire or radio, was rarely used by anyone else. Its ownership was understood, reinforced through repetition rather than instruction. Sitting elsewhere was part of maintaining order. The radio played a central role in these hours. News broadcasts, scheduled precisely, demanded silence and attention. Conversations paused, children were reminded to sit still, and even small noises were discouraged. The voice from the radio carried authority of its own, reinforcing the seriousness of the moment. Listening was not optional, it was a shared duty. Tea followed a similar pattern. It was served at a regular time, prepared consistently, and consumed with quiet appreciation. The act itself was simple, yet it symbolized order and routine. Cups were placed carefully, movements restrained. Tea was not a social event. It was a stabilizing ritual. Children learned to read subtle cues. A glance, a shift in posture, or a sigh communicated expectations clearly. Direct instructions were often unnecessary. Respect was shown, through compliance rather than conversation. These lessons were absorbed early, shaping how children understood authority and hierarchy. Conversation during these evenings was limited and purposeful. Topics remained practical and restrained. Emotional expression was minimal, and personal concerns were rarely discussed openly. The goal was calmness, not connection. Silence was not uncomfortable. It was preferred. The father's role extended beyond presence. He represented structure, routine, and continuity. His habits defined the household schedule, influencing when meals ended, when the radio was turned off, and when children prepared for bed. The evening belonged to him in a way that felt natural rather than enforced. This authority was rarely challenged. Cultural expectations supported it, framing paternal leadership as responsible and necessary. Questioning decisions or routines was uncommon, especially in front of children. Order was maintained through consistency rather than confrontation. For mothers, evenings marked a subtle shift as well. The day's labor continued, but visibility changed. Domestic tasks were completed quietly, often in the background. The focus moved away from managing the household toward maintaining calm. Harmony took priority over productivity. Children adapted to this structure by becoming quieter versions of themselves. Play was subdued, laughter controlled. Energy was contained. These hours taught restraint, reinforcing the idea that certain spaces and times demanded seriousness. Despite its formality, this environment provided predictability. After long days of school and work, the evening routine offered stability. Knowing what would happen and when reduced uncertainty. Order replaced chaos, even if it came at the cost of emotional warmth. The absence of overt affection did not imply absence of care. Provision, routine, and consistency were expressions of responsibility. Love was demonstrated through reliability rather than words. This understanding shaped how children later expressed care in their own lives. As bedtime approached, authority guided the transition. Instructions were brief and expected to be followed immediately. Resistance was rare, and delays were discouraged. The evening closed with the same quiet control that defined its beginning. These patterns repeated night after night, becoming deeply embedded. Even when circumstances changed, the memory of these evenings lingered. Many adults recalled the sound of the radio, the steady presence in the armchair, and the quiet order that filled the room. This structure influenced future relationships with authority. Some learned to value routine and predictability, finding comfort in clear roles. Others felt constrained, carrying a desire for expression that had been postponed rather than eliminated. The paternal authority of these evenings was not loud or forceful. It was calm, consistent, and unquestioned. Its strength lay in repetition and social reinforcement. By conforming to these rituals, families maintained stability in a world still recovering from upheaval. Evenings were not designed for emotional closeness. They were designed for rest, order, and preparation for the next day. Connection existed, but it was subtle and indirect. Shared silence, rather than conversation, became the bond. The living room at night reflected broader cultural values. Discipline, respect, and restraint were prioritized. Personal expression was secondary to collective calm. The home became a place where external pressures were managed through internal control. Over time, these evenings shaped how individuals approached rest and authority. Relaxation became associated with structure rather than freedom. Quiet became synonymous with comfort. Control replaced spontaneity. The legacy of these routines persisted long after radios were replaced and seating arrangements changed. The memory of controlled evenings influenced how people structured their own homes, often unconsciously repeating patterns learned in childhood. In 1950s London households, evenings were not chaotic or expressive. They were deliberate, calm, and centered around a quiet form of leadership. Through routine and restraint, families navigated the end of each day, preparing themselves for the endurance required once morning returned. Nightfall in a 1950s London household did not bring release or indulgence. Instead, it introduced another carefully managed phase of the day, one governed by order, repetition, and restraint. Bedtime routines were not designed to soothe or entertain. Their purpose was to prepare bodies and minds for rest in conditions that were rarely comfortable and never excessive. The process began early. Evenings ended at predictable hours, regardless of season or mood. Children were expected to recognize these signals without resistance. There was little negotiation. The structure of the day depended on consistency, and bedtime marked the final act of discipline before morning returned. Bath nights were infrequent and strategic. Hot water required effort, fuel, and planning, making daily bathing impractical. When baths did occur, they followed a strict order. Water was shared, cooling gradually as each child took a turn. Speed mattered more than comfort. The bath was not a place for relaxation, but for efficiency. Preparation for sleep was swift. Pajamas were practical rather than soft, often layered for warmth. Bedrooms remained cold, and fires were not lit upstairs. Children moved quickly, aware that lingering only prolonged discomfort. The goal was to get into bed as soon as possible, before warmth escaped entirely. Beds themselves were carefully arranged. Multiple blankets were layered deliberately, creating weight rather than softness. Sheets were tucked tightly, minimizing movement during the night. Hot water bottles, when available, were filled cautiously and placed with care. Their warmth was temporary, but deeply valued. The absence of heat shaped behavior. Children learned to lie still, conserving warmth by minimizing movement. Turning over too often meant losing heat trapped between blankets. Stillness became a skill, developed through necessity rather than instruction. Silence was expected. Talking after lights out was discouraged, and any noise risked correction. The house settled into quiet, broken only by familiar sounds, distant traffic, a ticking clock, or the settling of the building itself. These sounds became part of the night's rhythm. Discipline extended beyond behavior into emotion. Fear, discomfort, or restlessness were managed privately. Calling out was discouraged unless absolutely necessary. Children learned to self-soothe, often through repetition of thoughts or quiet imagination. Comfort came from routine rather than reassurance. Parents viewed this structure as preparation. Endurance during the night mirrored expectations during the day. Life required tolerance of discomfort, and nighttime was no exception. This philosophy was rarely explained explicitly. It was demonstrated consistently. Nighttime also reinforced hierarchy. Parents remained awake longer, maintaining control of the household until sleep claimed them. Children surrendered agency at the bedroom door, trusting that the structure would hold until morning. This trust was built through repetition rather than dialogue. Despite its rigidity, the routine offered predictability. Knowing what to expect reduced anxiety. The same sequence repeated each night, creating familiarity even in discomfort. Routine replaced uncertainty, providing stability in a world that still felt fragile. Dreams and thoughts filled the quiet hours. Without distractions, minds wandered. Children replayed events of the day, imagined future moments, or simply listened to the house breathe around them. These solitary reflections shaped inner worlds, often becoming more vivid in the absence of stimulation. Illness or restlessness disrupted the routine only slightly. Adjustments were minimal, reinforcing the idea that the system was resilient. Comfort was offered, but within limits. The routine remained intact, signaling reliability over flexibility. Morning always loomed ahead. Night was not an end, but a pause. Sleep served a functional purpose, restoring energy for the demands of the next day. This perspective framed rest as responsibility rather than indulgence. Over time, these nighttime routines became deeply ingrained. Many carried them into adulthood, maintaining structured sleep habits and valuing consistency over spontaneity. Rest became associated with order rather than relaxation. The emotional tone of nighttime was subdued. Affection existed, but it was understated. A brief word, a tucked blanket, or a closed door communicated care. Grand gestures were unnecessary. Reliability was enough. Cold, darkness, and silence combined to create an environment that demanded adaptation. Children learned to endure discomfort quietly, drawing strength from routine. These lessons shaped resilience, but also limited emotional expression. The house itself seemed to participate. Walls held heat briefly, then released it. Floors creaked softly. Windows reflected darkness back into the room. These sensory details became familiar companions, reinforcing the sense of containment. Nighttime discipline influenced how individuals later approached rest. Many found comfort in repetition and structure, while others sought warmth and softness as a contrast to early experiences. Both responses reflected the lasting impact of these routines. The absence of excess defined the experience. There were no bedtime stories every night, no elaborate rituals, no lingering conversations. Simplicity ruled. What existed was enough, even if it was not gentle. In these homes, sleep was not framed as escape. It was part of a cycle, necessary and expected. The night prepared the body for endurance, reinforcing the values learned throughout the day. These routines did not create dramatic memories. Instead, they left subtle impressions, shaping habits and expectations quietly. Their influence was felt later, in how people managed discomfort, silence, and routine. Nighttime in 1950s London households reflected the broader culture. Discipline, restraint, and practicality guided every action. Comfort was secondary to consistency. Within these constraints, families maintained stability, one night at a time. The end of the day did not soften expectations. It confirmed them. Through repetition and structure, nighttime routines reinforced endurance as a way of life, preparing each household to face another demanding morning. As the years passed, what lingered most powerfully was not a single definitive answer, but a growing list of questions that refused to settle. Despite investigations, official statements, and repeated reviews, the core mystery remained stubbornly intact. Each attempt to close the case seemed only to highlight how much was still unknown. Small inconsistencies, overlooked details, and conflicting testimonies continued to surface, keeping public doubt alive and ensuring that the story never truly faded away. One of the most troubling aspects was how early assumptions shaped the entire direction of the inquiry. From the outset, investigators appeared to favor certain explanations over others, sometimes before all the evidence had been carefully weighed. This early framing influenced which leads were prioritized and which were quietly set aside. In hindsight, critics argue that alternative theories may not have received the scrutiny they deserved, creating blind spots that were never fully corrected later on. Witness accounts added another layer of complexity. Some statements changed over time, while others contradicted each other in subtle but significant ways. Memory is fragile, especially under stress, and as months turned into years, the reliability of these recollections became harder to assess. Yet even allowing for human error, there were moments when discrepancies seemed too large to ignore. These gaps fueled speculation that crucial information was either misunderstood or never properly followed up. Physical evidence, often seen as the most objective part of any investigation, did not provide the clarity many hoped for. Certain items raised more questions than they answered, while other potentially important traces were lost, contaminated, or dismissed as irrelevant. Advances in technology later sparked renewed interest, as people wondered whether modern methods might reveal insights that were impossible at the time. However, by then, the passage of time had already taken its toll, limiting what could realistically be recovered. Media coverage played a powerful role in shaping public perception. Intense attention kept the case in the spotlight but also risked oversimplifying complex details. Headlines favored dramatic angles, sometimes at the expense of nuance, and speculation often blurred into accepted narrative. While this coverage helped ensure the story was not forgotten, it also contributed to a climate where rumors could spread just as quickly as verified facts. Another unresolved issue involved potential connections that were hinted at but never firmly established. Certain individuals appeared on the periphery of the story, raising eyebrows without ever being conclusively linked to events. Their presence suggested broader networks or hidden dynamics that were never fully mapped out. Whether these connections were genuinely significant or simply coincidental remains a matter of debate, but their existence continues to provoke curiosity and suspicion. Official reviews and inquiries attempted to address public concerns, yet each one seemed to leave lingering dissatisfaction. Reports acknowledged mistakes or procedural shortcomings but stopped short of offering decisive conclusions. For some, these admissions reinforced trust in institutional transparency. For others, they felt like partial truths that avoided deeper accountability. The sense that something important was still missing only strengthened calls for further examination. The human impact of these unanswered questions cannot be overlooked. For those closest to the case, uncertainty became a constant companion. Without clear resolution, closure remained out of reach, replaced by a cycle of hope and disappointment each time new information emerged. Even for the wider public, the lack of answers fostered a shared unease, a feeling that the story represented something larger than a single incident. Over time, the case evolved into a symbol of systemic limitations. It highlighted how even high-profile investigations can struggle with bias, resource constraints, and the pressure of public expectation. Discussions about it often shifted from the specifics of what happened to broader conversations about how justice systems operate and where they can fall short. In this way, the mystery transcended its original context and became a reference point for institutional reform debates. The persistence of unanswered questions also invited alternative narratives. Independent researchers, journalists, and online communities revisited old evidence, sometimes uncovering overlooked details or offering fresh interpretations. While not all of these efforts were equally rigorous, they demonstrated a collective unwillingness to accept uncertainty as the final word. The case became a living archive, continuously re-examined through new lenses. Yet, with each passing year, the challenge of finding definitive answers grew steeper. Witnesses aged, memories faded, and records became harder to access. The distance from the original events made it increasingly difficult to separate what was known from what had been assumed over time. This gradual erosion of clarity raised a sobering question: at what point does a mystery become unsolvable, not because the truth is unreachable, but because the path to it has been obscured by time? Despite these obstacles, the story's endurance suggests that the search for understanding still matters. Unanswered questions have a unique power. They compel reflection, skepticism, and dialogue. They remind us that certainty is not always attainable, but the pursuit of it can still hold value. Even without definitive conclusions, the process of questioning can expose weaknesses, challenge complacency, and inspire change. In the end, what remains is not just a list of unresolved details, but a collective sense of unfinished business. The case continues to hover between explanation and doubt, refusing to be neatly categorized or forgotten. Its unanswered questions act like echoes, reminding us that some stories do not end cleanly, and that the absence of clear answers can be just as impactful as their presence. As long as those questions remain, the shadow they cast will endure over the investigation, over public memory, and over the broader conversation about truth and accountability. And perhaps that is the final legacy of this chapter, not closure, but a lasting reminder that mystery, once embedded in history, has a way of surviving long after the headlines fade. With time, the case moved beyond the boundaries of a single investigation and settled into something larger. A lasting legacy shaped by uncertainty, debate, and reflection. Even without definitive answers, its influence continued to ripple outward, affecting how similar cases were discussed, investigated, and remembered. What endured was not only the mystery itself, but the lessons drawn from it, lessons that still resonate years later. One of the most significant aspects of this legacy lies in how it changed public awareness. The case taught audiences to look more closely at official narratives and to recognize that early conclusions are not always final truths. People became more attentive to how information is presented, what details are emphasized, and which questions remain unasked. This shift did not necessarily lead to widespread distrust, but rather to a more cautious, critical engagement with complex stories. For investigative bodies, the case became a reference point for self-examination. Discussions around it often highlighted the importance of avoiding tunnel vision, especially in the early stages of an inquiry. When investigators focus too narrowly on one explanation, they risk overlooking alternative possibilities that may later prove crucial. In this sense, the story became a reminder that flexibility and openness are not weaknesses, but essential components of thorough investigative work. The role of communication also emerged as a central lesson. Clear, consistent updates can help maintain public confidence, while silence or vague statements often invite speculation. In this case, gaps in communication allowed rumors to flourish, sometimes overshadowing verified facts. Over time, institutions began to recognize that transparency when possible is not merely a public relations strategy, but a responsibility to those seeking clarity and reassurance. Technological progress added another layer to the case's enduring relevance. Advances in data analysis, forensic science, and digital record-keeping prompted ongoing conversations about what might have been possible under different circumstances. While technology alone cannot solve every mystery, its evolution underscored the importance of preserving evidence and documentation carefully. Future cases, shaped by these advancements, would benefit from systems designed to withstand the passage of time. The media's influence formed another key part of the story's afterlife. The case illustrated both the power and the risk of sustained coverage. On one hand, attention kept the story alive and prevented it from being quietly shelved. On the other, repeated retellings sometimes simplified complexities or leaned too heavily on dramatic framing. The lesson here was not that coverage is harmful, but that responsibility and balance are crucial when dealing with unresolved narratives. Beyond institutions and media, the case left a profound mark on the public imagination. It became a shared point of reference, frequently cited in discussions about uncertainty and unresolved outcomes. People returned to it not only for answers, but for meaning, trying to understand what it revealed about systems, decision-making, and the limits of knowledge. In this way, the story transformed from a singular event into a broader cultural touchstone. Educationally, the case found new life as a subject of analysis. Students of journalism, law, and social sciences examined it as a real-world example of complexity without closure. Instead of offering neat conclusions, it encouraged critical thinking and ethical debate. How should responsibility be assigned when certainty is impossible? What standards should guide reporting when facts are incomplete? These questions ensured the story's relevance in academic spaces long after active investigations had slowed. There was also a quieter, more human legacy. For those personally affected, the passage of time did not erase the emotional weight of unanswered questions. The absence of resolution shaped lives in subtle but lasting ways, influencing decisions, memories, and expectations. Their experiences reminded observers that behind every unresolved case are real people, living with ambiguity that cannot be neatly summarized or resolved by reports and timelines. As years turned into decades, the case's endurance itself became part of its meaning. Stories that persist without answers challenge the assumption that every question can be neatly resolved. They force a confrontation with uncertainty and highlight the limits of even the most determined efforts. This realization can be uncomfortable, but it is also honest, acknowledging that complexity is sometimes an unavoidable part of reality. At the same time, the continued interest demonstrated something hopeful. It showed a collective refusal to forget, and a belief that reflection still has value even when conclusions are elusive. Each new discussion, documentary, or analysis was not simply an attempt to solve the mystery, but an effort to learn from it. The case became less about reaching a final answer and more about understanding the process that led to uncertainty. In broader terms, the story contributed to evolving expectations around accountability. It reminded audiences that responsibility does not end when an investigation concludes, especially if questions remain. Ongoing review, openness to reevaluation, and willingness to acknowledge limitations emerged as standards against which future cases would be measured. The legacy, then, was not just about what went wrong or right, but about how systems respond when certainty cannot be achieved. Ultimately, the lasting importance of the case lies in its ability to provoke thought rather than provide closure. It stands as a reminder that some stories resist final explanations, and that their value may lie in what they teach rather than how they end. By encouraging skepticism, empathy, and careful analysis, it continues to shape conversations long after the original events receded into history. In this sense, the story never truly concludes. Its legacy lives on in the questions it raised, the lessons it offered, and the awareness it inspired. Even without definitive answers, it remains meaningful and enduring example of how mystery, when approached thoughtfully, can deepen understanding rather than diminish it. As we step back and look at the full picture, what stands out most is not just the mystery itself, but the space it leaves behind. A space filled with unanswered questions, quiet doubts, and lessons that continue to echo long after the events have passed. This story reminds us that not every narrative ends with certainty, and not every truth arrives neatly packaged. Sometimes, what matters most is the act of remembering, questioning, and refusing to let important stories fade into silence. By revisiting cases like this, we are not only searching for answers, we are honoring the complexity of real lives and real systems. We are acknowledging that uncertainty can still hold meaning, and that reflection can be just as powerful as resolution. Even without a final conclusion, the story continues to invite us to think more carefully, listen more closely, and remain open to perspectives that may have been overlooked. Thank you for spending your time here today and for staying with this story until the very end. If you found it thought-provoking, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into stories that challenge what we think we know. Until next time, take care and thank you for watching.